both a theft. Piracy is illegal, it's unreliable, it's harmful. Possibly we place greater emphasis on the commercial impact than the ethical, but both are important here. And they're both linked. Enforcement agencies are cracking down on piracy. Those who sell illegal streams are going to jail. For those who watch pirated streams, it's a bit like shoplifting through your phone. And there are the ethical issues around this. If you're paying for a stream from someone, or not paying for a stream from someone who's accessed it illegally, you would wonder what ethical code they operate under. There's no protection for children, no protection for malicious software, which could expose people to theft of personal data and financial scams. It's not just about Skyless, or just about sport, it goes beyond that. There are millions of people employed in the creative economy. A lot of you students are going to be in this as well. And this piracy puts jobs at risk. We and others invest heavily to bring paying customers the best sports content and news. Those who are paying legally are subsidising those who don't. Indeed, if more people were paying legally, you could argue that costs could come down. Those accessing illegal streams are supporting criminality. Indeed, they're putting themselves at risk. They have no idea how those sites will use their data. And then there's the issue around ripping. Gathering and producing news is hard work. It takes skill, perseverance, professionalism, and it costs. But more and more sites are ripping and lifting content. No journalism of their own. No checks, no attempt to develop a story. Any newsroom anywhere where it sees a good story elsewhere will try to follow it up. But the correct way to do that is to make your own checks. First step is verify and confirm the story firsthand. And then look for your own lines, find ways to develop it. At Sky Sports News, we hate being beaten to a story, but it happens. When it happens, we work hard to take ownership of that story by putting in calls, researching data, looking for new lines and ways to develop and move that story on. What we find unethical is other sites, and it's mainly on the digital media platforms, lifting stories, video, graphics, data, our research, publishing them without any checks or any credit. We do that because for us, trust is important. And all our research shows that viewers and our readers trust us as a reliable news service. And that, of course, brings responsibilities and challenges for us. Rolling news puts huge pressures on journalists. It means we rarely have time to stand back and ask deeper questions, deeper ethical questions in particular. The day-to-day demands of Sky Sports News sometimes make it difficult to have a look at the bigger picture around this. As an example, many sports journalists have long had mixed feelings about covering boxing. I've got great respect for boxers, but I started to look more closely into the damage caused to the brain with each punch, how a hook shakes up the brain even more than a jab. How when this is repeated time after time, fight after fight, it can cause permanent brain damage, often only becoming apparent years after the boxer has retired. The bigger the conflict, for me, the bigger the challenge for these fighters, the harder it is as the years go by. Early on as a sports journalist, I used to meet a lot of ex-fighters. Lovely guys, but obviously they weren't all in the greatest of health. And the question I was never really able to answer was how much of this ill health was caused by their time in the ring or caused by boxing. Now, our boxing reporters are excellent journalists, and there's a huge demand. It's one of the most popular sports. I think Joe's research will show boxing's up there as one of the most popular sports that people go and want to find out about. How do we balance this? We're responsible journalists, especially the hype around a big fight. How do we balance that with continuing to report on the risk to fighters? Well, we talk about it a lot. First thing, we know that the fighters know boxing is a dangerous sport. You go to any gym, you'll see signs up there warning about how dangerous boxing is, for just constantly reminding the fighters there. And boxing does have a huge number of virtues. For many people, it gives them a structure to their lives, discipline, fitness, sense of well-being. For many still, it is, the old Rocky story, it's a way to a better and more fulfilling life. And the people who run the sport take safety and medical support really seriously. As journalists, we have a big role to play in monitoring standards, holding promoters and governing bodies to account, and reporting the research. Indeed, because the sport is so commercially important, it's even more vital for those who promote it and make a living out of it, and those who broadcast it, that it remains commercially successful. It's vital that the sport, like any sport, is as safe as it can be, that it's run correctly, with the health and safety of its participants paramount. Our reporting has to balance the appetite of the audience for news about the fight, and for all the talk about the noble art of defence and not being hit. Boxing is still about trying to hit the other guy so hard you knock him out. We have to balance that with the right coverage about safety in the sport. But it is in everyone's interest that the sport is safe, that boxers are given every protection. So we wrestle with that regularly. Well, boxing is possibly the oldest sport. It's also one of the most basic. But like other sports, rules about fair play are essential. Control over gloves, no punching below the belt. Sports journalism in many ways is a competition, head-to-head with rivals for viewers and eyeballs. But in the way of boxing, fans expect fighters to win clean, so our viewers and readers expect us to be clean in our news gathering. They have to trust we are doing the right thing in the way we find and report our sports news. Much of that is covered in our code of conduct. We only gather news by straightforward means. The use of other means can only be justified by the overriding consideration of the public interest. Now that's a loose enough kind of guide to give you a bit of debate, what's in the public interest, how far should we stray from being straightforward or from our code of conduct. Something we take really seriously, and it makes sense on many levels. After all, the bigger the story, the bigger chance it will involve someone rich, powerful, clever, and with access to good lawyers and good PR people. And the danger is if we're not behaving ethically in the way we gather that story, they can deflect attention away from the story itself. So the way we've gathered the story becomes the focus rather than the story itself. And this was apparent really early days of Sky Sports News. First year we launched Sky Sports News, 1998. There was a massive story in the States, a couple of baseball players, Sammy Sosa, Chicago Cubs, Mark McGuire, St. Louis Cardinals, head-to-head for a new record for the number of home runs in one season. The story we were covering was fantastic for the rolling sports news channel as the narrative developed every single day. And these two guys were becoming household names in the UK through that coverage. Now, in the States, reporters are allowed into locker rooms. It so happened that one reporter, a guy called Steve Wilstead from AP, spotted, in one of the locker rooms, in Mark McGuire's locker, he spotted a bottle which looked very suspicious. When he looked more closely, he found it was andro, an anabolic steroid. So it's a big story. Journalist broke the story, but then he found himself at the centre of the story with the way he'd reported it. Some senior baseball figures, and indeed a lot of baseball writers, criticised him for acting unethically by snooping and going through Maguire's private and personal effects. Again, there are several nuances around this story, because firstly, at the time, andro was banned in the Olympics, the NFL and other sports, but wasn't banned by baseball. And that gave baseball writers a chance to play down the significance of the story. Others were more tenacious, and eventually it led to congressional hearings and a new drug testing process in Major League Baseball. But the challenge at the time for how you gathered that story was really interesting. So, is it ever right to go against your code, to behave unethically when chasing a story? I mentioned earlier that one of our reporters doorstepped a supposedly frail man in his 70s against his wishes and those of his colleagues. It's something we discussed and we decided we had to do. Well, some of you maybe think that's a bit odd. Why they do that when they harp on about ethical behaviour? Well, the 70-year-old man in question was Sepp Blatter, who was head of FIFA. Now, Ofcom guidelines say doorstepping can be used when there are repeated refusals to grant interviews. He was giving interviews, he'd lots of press conferences. But these press conferences, and Tracy will know because she sits on both sides of the fence here, are tactical battles now. The PR people around Blatter would carefully orchestrate these press conferences. They may seem to be open, but they're not. These are, it's so coordinated. They don't answer the questions. They use great time-wasting tactics that they give Blatter and others. Not answering what's been asked, carefully rehearsed answers, interrupting any fluency from the floor. You can't ask a follow-up question when they haven't answered what you want. Making sure the interviewee goes back to the message house, which the PR people prepare for them at every opportunity. It's all a charade. It gives the appearance of an open press conference, but in reality it's nothing like that. But at the time, Blatter, as is so often in his time at FIFA, had big questions to answer. We knew we could find ways to get to him. But that also brings up ethical questions. We can ask people that we know, security staff, chauffeurs, doormen, great contacts, all, who can tell us which car he'll be in, which door he'll be coming out of. But of course, they could also face the sack if their employers found out they'd talked to us. So again, how much do we push these people to help us on this? Luckily, a lot of people are quite willing to talk to us. We found out which door he'd be leaving his hotel by, which car he'd be getting in. We doorstepped. We're the only people there. We chased him down the street, and he did stop. The reporter blocked his path into the car, asked him some questions, and it's a really good reporter, a guy called Brian Swanson. You've probably come across him if you watch Sky Sports News. Got some really good answers, which are much better than you would get from the press conference. We had an exclusive which was picked up by all our rivals and competitors. And it also shone a torch, or touch of light, really, on the darker goings on at FIFA at that time. So, is there a formula for what is right? Is it ever appropriate for sports journalists to behave unethically? I haven't got the answer. But I am excited that there is now a big debate going on. That sports journalists are now more aware of ethical issues around sport, how they are distinct from regulation and compliance, how they affect the way we work every single day. When chasing a story, it's always tempting to go that bit further to stand it up. The bigger the story, the bigger the temptation. And for editors, these are really difficult judgments, particularly if the way we gather the story becomes the story rather than the story we've uncovered. As they may say in baseball, if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. And they may at times in baseball get away with it, but you won't get away with it in journalism covering sport. What is clear as news gathering gets harder, the role of the sports journalist is changing. Ethical issues around sports reporting are changing, and people are thinking more seriously about these. And that's good, that's really good. And like the best stories that we cover, there's always another twist around the corner. So thank you for your time.
Bang on time. No Fergie time of you. Well done. Cheers. Thank you very much. Before we break for lunch, I just wondered if you want to take the opportunity to ask Andy a question. He's got a few minutes to expand or go into areas topics we haven't covered. Ina.
Going back to the point that sports journalism is moving away from the so-called toy department, do you think the boundaries between, let's say, financial journalists, sports journalists, investigative journalists such as Andrew Jennings are fading? Will there be a title such as sports journalist in 10 years?
I think there will. It's interesting. I've had some good debates with Andrew Jennings. And he says, in the same way I used to criticise the old journalists for not digging deep into the stories. He says, you 24-hour boys, you don't dig, look at me. But you work with Andrew, you know how much time he takes on the story. And so there's room for all these different sorts of journalists. We should be complementing each other.
Yes.
What the work Andrew does is fantastic, but he needs a really patient editor, a really strong producer, and time. It takes time to do that. But it's absolutely vital that people like Andrew are still doing that role. And it's also vital is that once they've broken this story, once they've uncovered something, that rolling news channels and other sports journalists then follow up and develop on that story. So the role, I think you still need specialist journalists because you need that knowledge. What I think is really important is that where you had specialist departments in the past, they probably weren't as rounded. You need to be far more rounded now. Sports journalists of the day has to understand, not just ethics, they have to understand law, they have to understand all the things that you'll learn on an NCCJ course, about public administration, public affairs. You need to be, it's match reporting, as someone said earlier, that's gone. It's still good to be able to write a match report very quickly, but you need to have much more standing to put sports stories in the broader context. That's what I think people need now.
And will there be room for specialised sports journalists such as football corruption journalists, like these kind of niche?
Interesting title. Yes, because the sports beat is so big that I think we've moved away. Our golf reporters are now not in the pockets of golf in the way that they possibly were several years ago, or 20, 30 years ago. They can take a step back and be more critical.
John.
Andy, you're part of the original wing of Sky Sports Empire. Can you put your hand on your heart and say that the rights holders have never made a phone call to you and say, look here, Andy, don't go there. We're just negotiating rights on X, X, and X.
Yes, because they haven't. But it is a nuanced and difficult at times relationship. It also works in our favour. There's a story about a rights holder. They will pick up the phone to us and talk to us about the story. So we know, and you build trust. Again, we have to declare, like I'd expect an individual to declare a conflict of interest if they're reporting about a story about their brother or something they've got a financial stake in. We have to declare that if we have a financial stake in something. So it does possibly at times affect what we can say on some stories. Like we can't get involved in discussions about what the next round of TV rights would be or what the structure will be. We can't use that information. There's some information that people at Sky will have that I don't know, and it would be wrong for me to get into speculation on it.
You never killed the story or tempered it as a result of a phone call?
No. Vic Wakely, when he was head of Sky Sports, was really worried about me taking over because I've got a news background. And we came to an understanding. He said, look, just tell me. All he needed was a heads up if we had a story about chairman, big mates with some of the Newcastle board at the time. When we got a couple of stories about them, all he needed was me to phone him to say, we're going to do this story, put it to us, want you to know in advance. So he was then ready for when they phoned him. Vic was a great supporter of it. We're in the relationship with Team Sky is interesting as well. We're independent of Team Sky, and even though it comes under Sky, so we have good access to Team Sky, but not great access, and they have no control over what we say. It's quite tricky at times.
We're going to have to have some of these questions over lunch, I think. We'll just have room for one, two maybe.
Could I pick you up on something, Andy? An interesting lecture, and I like the idea that actually, as regulated broadcasters, you're almost better off than the unregulated wild west of the rest of the sports journalism world. But I'll cogitate on that one. You talked about truth and being honest. I think slightly worrying for me. You started saying that if rumours started circulating, you'd have to report them, although you're honest with your audience.
No, we report that they're a rumour.
Yes, I know that, but all I know is, as a background in the BBC for 34 years, if we did that on that basis, and that rumour turned out to be false, well, we'd be hung out to dry. And so I'm not saying we're any better or worse. All I'm saying is that that's where the line stops, where I come from. And I worry that by doing that, let's say, for instance, the obvious example is death of a royal. If it was proved to be wrong, I mean, our feet wouldn't even touch the ground.
No, we wouldn't. The rumours I'm talking about are, Rafa Benitez has left Newcastle.
Well, but that gets into the fake news rumours.
That does, yeah. And then that starts to.
Are you not legitimising fake news?
No, because there will impact on sports betting. There'll be betting markets that will be affected by this. And sometimes, I suspect that people have started fake sports news stories to make a few bob.
Well, like agents do all the time.
Yeah, to make a few bob on by manipulating betting markets. Betfair, for example, next manager be sacked if they start a story that would be Rafa Benitez. So these things. So we're very selective about the stories we do. But when there's a lot of people talking about saying, well, what's really going on here? We think it's our duty to say, look, we know, we're checking it. It's got to be a tipping point. That comes down to judgment, and each story is very different.
I would worry about that, and I think that's where the BBC would draw our line. And that's a good case of you not being first with the news, but that's what people would know to, because people go to the BBC to say, is it really true? To try and differentiate between fake news, is Benitez sacked, whatever. So I think that's where we diverge, and it's an interesting discussion point as to when you start reporting effectively what might be fake news.
And correcting fake news.
Well, the trouble is the trouble is nowadays you can't wait till the following day's edition. That horse is bolted, and a BBC rumour source, whatever is halfway around the world in 10 seconds, and that's always the worry, as has been said earlier on.
I thought it was, sorry, sorry. We can keep going, but I've tried to keep the food out so that it doesn't disturb, but we can keep going as long as we can now start bringing the food
Yeah,
in. So keep
I
going
think
with the
I
questions.
think this is an ongoing because I think there's some really interesting debate here, but also some rivalry between the BBC and the
No. I'm 60 months out of the BBC.
Yeah.
I'm trying to say I'm no better or worse. I'm saying that the BBC would take the view that we will not do that, and that's a decision that they've taken. I mean, like my ex-colleague Dan is over there. Would you put something up on the BBC website to say there are rumours are going around that Rafa Benitez